Welcome to the semi-final round of the National Schools Debate Championship. My name is Apili Cynthia Esther, and I am going to be the chair for this particular semi-final. On panel with me will be Abenaitwe Davis, Chewalianga Henry, Magomu Raymond, Namudu Rona Philomena, Rahim, the Nigerian, and Wandia Muchiri. On the motion, info slide, degrowth is an economic theory that advocates for a deliberate reduction in economic activity and resource consumption. It challenges the conventional wisdom that perpetual economic growth is essential for human well-being. The motion, this House believes that the concept of degree to address environmental issues. Arguing from side proposition in this particular debate, Will Booty. Congratulations for making it to the finals. May the odds be in your favors. We'll be having 6 minutes for first speakers, 5 minutes for second and third speakers. You have 3 minutes of prep time comprehensively in between, and course examination would be 2 minutes. Any questions before we start? 2 minutes. 3 minutes. Okay, may the odds be in your favors. Let's have first affirmative speaker. Here.
Hey everyone, my name is Hussein. I'm going to be the first speaker from side proposition. On the motion, this House believes that the concept of degrowth economics is necessary to address environmental issues. Okay. So my speech begins in 3, 2, 1, go. Our burden in this debate is quite simple. 2 key things. A, we are supposed to show you why the concept of degrowth inherently or is approximate response or provides approximate approach towards fighting things like climate change in that particular regard. Their burden then is to show us why then without the existence of degrowth, we will not have this sort of like approach towards fighting things like climate change. I think we have to understand something here. On our side, we support the theory that advocates for deliberate reduction in economic activity and resource consumption. Without the existence of this theory, that inherently imposes a counter theory on their side. That is to say, the theory that exists on their side is that we should prioritize things like perpetual growth, we should prioritize things like economic activity, we should prioritize things like resource consumption. There are 2 key things that then happen in their world. Notice that in their world, the sort of like economic system that then exists prioritizes things like GDP growth at the expense of ecological balance. On our world, we shift the narrative to focus on sustainability rather than exploitation, rather than economic growth, rather than expansion. And this happens in quite a number of ways, through things like reducing resource extraction, reducing industrial activity. We think on that regard, degrowth addresses the key issues. The second thing you have to understand is the importance of this theory, right? Notice, when this theory is indoctrinated within society, it is most likely to influence the way individuals behave. That is to say, with the existence of degrowth, people then are more likely to compromise things like economic benefits and necessarily make an approach towards fighting things like climate change. We think that then on that particular regard, the impact that the theory, the counter theory that inherently exists on their side is that people then prioritize things like economic growth at the expense of the environment. The third thing, you have to understand the nature of environmental issues. 3 things. A, notice that economic growth in and of itself is the proximate cause to things like environmental issues. Why is this true? economic growth involves things like clearing wetlands so that you probably increase the number of industries existing, to things like destroying forests to avail more land for industries. That inherently shows you when you prioritize things like economic growth, you inherently impose an impact onto the environment at the end of the day. But also thirdly, you then have to necessarily understand what deliberate reduction means on our side of the house. Two things. Deliberate reduction means that individuals are able to compromise their personal benefits, but also two, it means that to the extent that a certain activity has a negative impact on the environment, we are ready to do away with it, even with the consideration that it might probably lead to development. The intuition pump on our side is quite simple. We say, when you have diabetes, reduce on the sugar consumption. Do not consider the fact that probably sugar is sweet, but reduce on the sugar consumption, because this is more proximate to necessarily ensuring that you're not negatively affected, right? Thirdly, you have to understand sort of like preemptive on what might come from their side. They'll say that we think economic development is important for people to exist, right? I think the first analysis lies in like the poor states, right? Because this is where the development they advocate for necessarily happens. Three key responses. A, notice that in poor states, development is done by foreign investors. That is to say, this sort of like poor states are exposed to things like profit repatriation, which means even when you compromise the existence of the environment, you're not able to benefit from the advantage, you're not able to benefit from this sort of like decisions because of most of the profits are repatriated in that particular regard. But also secondly, we think development in and of itself is something that is short-lived, i.e. it is affected by things like environmental hazards, things like floods, right? Floods and landslide go on to like destroy the existence of various institutions. To that extent, we think it is more proximate for the concept of this sort of like degrowth to exist within status quo at the end of the day. But also secondly, I know that we'll talk about things like backlash. Notice, this debate will show you that when this theory is indoctrinated, everyone believes that we should necessarily trade off things like economic development because we want to support that, we want to like create an impact on climate change. That inherently means there is a consensus that we should necessarily protect the environment, so things like backlash do not exist on our side of the house. Into argumentation, we think this sort of like world is more principally justified based on the principle of intergenerational equity. Notice that individuals or within ourselves, we have an obligation to do practices that do not compromise the existence of future generations. That is to say, you do not prioritize your satisfaction, you do not prioritize things like benefits from short-termism, but you make a more proximate response towards ensuring that there's some sort of like comfortable living for those people that are going to exist after you. The impact of this sort of like principle is quite simple. This principle exists in our world because individuals embrace it and are more likely to take on action, are more likely to take on practices that necessarily benefit the environment. This principle does not exist on their world, and in that particular regard, individuals do not compromise things like economic development. Even when I show you that economic development is affected by things like environmental hazards, we think to that extent we are able to make that trade-off, right? Secondly, on the whole idea on how this sort of like theory supplements on the already existing mechanisms within status quo. Notice that within status quo, we have mechanisms like taxation, carbon taxation. We have things like green technology, right? Without the existence of this theory, the buying onto this mechanism is significantly less. We think what you then do on our side of the house, with the existence of this theory, you then give these individuals an incentive to buy into these things. The impact is quite simple. They're able to necessarily take action on things that destroy the environment. I beg to rest.
Okay, we thank the speaker for that speech. We welcome the first segment of cross-examination for this particular round. Here.
Okay, thank you. So do you think there are many countries which are struggling financially in the world? Are they there?
Those countries are there, okay, but then so the analysis lies on where you should prioritize going forward at the expense of the environment or at the expense.
The question is coming. So do you think in your side of the house, sustainability includes human survival? Does it?
I think the motion says there is deliberate reduction. That is to say, if an economic activity does not put a negative impact on the environment, that economic activity still exists, so development in and of itself will exist on our world.
The question is, does sustainability include human survival?
Does?
your sustainability include human survival?
Obviously.
So the question is now, if these countries are already struggling financially, how does reducing the financial muscle make them survive?
I think the response is quite simple. We say that you compromise any action that is going to degrade the environment. So you have the ability or choice to engage in economic practices that do not compromise the environment. I think that is quite simple.
Okay. So you are already not surviving, but you can survive on raw. Okay.
Even when you're able to prove that, profits are repatriated, so there's nothing like that in your world.
Do you think people use resources for fun?
People use?
Do you think they use resources for fun?
Exactly. We say that we should only consume what we need, not more than what we need. The theory that spreads on their side is that we just consume, right? Because we think we should consume.
So the question is, instead of stopping taking carbohydrates, wouldn't it be a better solution to take insulin?
I think if at all the carbohydrates are the reason as to why you probably have things like marasmus, you're most likely to like stop doing those particular things.
Like the impact is stopped with the insulin anyways, right?
Notice that the solution you provide on your side, the theory that exists on your side is that we prioritize things like economic development.
You eat as much as you can, but you can mitigate the effect.
The proximity is quite simple. The reason as to why your condition will probably get worse is because you take in more sugar. What we say, stop taking the sugar in that particular regard.
Okay, we thank the speakers for that, and that closes the first segment of course examination for this round. We welcome the first opposition speaker to advance the case for Oak Bench. Here.
Okay, I'd like to start my speech right away, if that's okay with the timer. Okay, cool. I think I'll start my speech with a bit of engagement on particularly what they say. I have a precise problem with the idea that economic growth or economic development equals pollution. I think that is not ideally entirely true. I think the repercussions or what comes about from economic growth then causes the pollution. I think the fumes that come from the industries and these developments that come from these industries then equals to the pollution. So I think if the idea and the debate is the repercussions of economic growth causing pollution, then the idea should be to stop the repercussions of economic growth. Moving on, I think they do not understand that economic growth is then essential for survival. They think that most probably in low development areas, it is the idea of investors to invest in these industries and then take away the money at the end of the day. I think even if investors invested in a country like Uganda, it doesn't take away the amount of jobs they could have created for the people in Uganda. It does not take away the amount of impact they could have had to the lives of the Ugandans in that particular instance. They need to cater for the amount of jobs or the sort of employment that the investors or even any sort of economic development gives the people in that particular country. But then also too, on the idea that development is most probably short-lived. I think the idea that development is short-lived is most probably myopic, but then also on the idea that we do not get a proper mechanism on how people compromise to pollution. They think that most probably just because people want to take care for maybe their children or the generations to come, it is incentive enough for them to take care and compromise to pollution. We do not get proper mechanism on why particularly people do that, aside from just the general, utopian care for the world to come. But then also too, I think an idea on what particularly degrowth insists of. I think degrowth radically is most probably harmful, impractical, and also largely radical. I think we need to understand the impacts that degrowth has on the economy and on the social well-being, even on the implement of jobs and the sort of things that impact the general livelihoods of people, as well as the sort of things that economic development and growth create for the general public. But then also, the idea that most probably economic growth comes along with social development. When government gets revenue to invest within social infrastructure and build society that particular way is something they also need to cater for. But then also too, the idea of global inequalities, the idea that within developing countries, it is very essential for their survival to have economic growth in particular place. I think you increase the gap of global inequality when you create things like that. But then also too, we include the idea of at how in their particular base, they do not take care of maybe the emissions that maybe companies have already created. The best they do is stop emissions in that particular sense. They do nothing to take care for the damage already done and most probably leave the climate or the environment in the particular situation it is already in. If we're trying to make change and difference, we ought to root for something that maybe reverses the clock on the impacts that climate has had within our lives. But then also too, I think we just need to stress on the importance of economic growth aside from just social infrastructure. The idea of ever increasing population. If you limit economic growth, you limit the chances for the future that they are still hoping for. For the future of the population that is ever increasing, you limit the jobs available for them. You limit the livelihoods they're going to have. You directly impact the generations to come when you do not allow room for free economic growth and free trade. But then also too, on the idea of global inequality and how it is exacerbated in that particular idea. So we then move on to what would most probably be a better solution. I think a better solution is to prioritize things like society and economic growth. I think on the importance of economic growth, we can have existence of companies and economic growth aside with sort of mitigation on the amount of emissions they release into the environment. I think a lot of initiatives can be put into place, like making it a prerequisite for them to operate in particular countries like that, but then also sort of making it cheaper for companies to access these things. They make the assertion that most probably companies do not, invest in green tech or sort of things like that, just because maybe they don't feel like they should, or that sort of idea. I think maybe for poor companies, the idea is not even just about, being able to or wanting to. The idea is on whether or not they can afford it. So if we make sort of these things, more affordable for companies like that, we aim to look at the larger group of people. But then too, the idea that we need to protect the economy and the influence the economy could have on us most probably. But then also the idea of how degrowth is most probably utopian in nature and on questioning on the implementation of this progress. I think if there's a capitalist nature that exists, or even within government, where government is most probably trying to protect its prized possession, its economy, the economy that gives its money, that particular thing means that we have opposition from government, opposition from investors, and opposition from people that they want to implement that thing. So we cannot question a policy, or we begin to question a policy when we think we do not gain traction from the very people who are supposed to be implementing it. If there's a lot of opposition, we question on whether that particular policy will gain traction. That's just something they should ought to think about. But then also the idea of what is most urgent. I think that we need to reverse the clock, and that is something very important. All affirmative roots for is the idea of leaving things the way they are. They do not cater for the jobs that will be lost, and even do not cater for the environment conditions we are living in now. Because if the environment conditions in 2024 could persist for a very long time, then the impacts they are looking for could just remain that way. We do not see any true change in their particular world. And also the idea of urgency in this particular matter. I think it is very urgent for us to then reverse the clock. And then most probably putting a cap on industries and limiting economic growth does most probably nothing. The best it does at any condition is it just reduces the amount of pollution and does nothing to curb it. We need green tech initiatives, we need reforestation measures. These are things that actually create real actual change in this particular idea. So if affirmative is to win, or to win on any ground, they need to cater for most probably the society and that particular thing. But then also, on the idea of trade-off, it is very important to understand what individuals value. On whether individuals value most probably their financial well-being and their abilities to take care of their families, or the plan, or the hope that their children may most probably live in a world with not so hot temperatures. That particular understanding then roots to affirmative side. So it is wrong for us to imagine that individuals do not care about their financial well-being, about their financial positions, even within society. It is not a worthy trade-off for any person in the most right state of mind to make in that particular hand. We still question workability on that particular sense. I think then ideas that need to move on is how they benefit society and economic development. Cross-examination.
We thank the speaker for that speech. We welcome the second segment of cross-examination. I kindly request that whoever is behind us, please do not make noise.
Okay. Speaker, are you fine?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a few questions. I'm going to start, I think I should start cross-examination now. So do people inside the school die due to landslides and floods?
Well, there's people dying and living the condition that
Do
way
we
it is
register
changes
deaths
nothing.
due to landslides
I
and
think we
floods?
do, and we need to do something to take the clock
Second
back.
question. Please differentiate between economic growth and perpetual economic growth.
Well, on both particular sides, if you limit economic growth, then the increased population needs to be taken care for.
Okay,
Because
she'll
the
help you
increased
define.
population is
So,
increasing rapidly.
You say that developing countries are poor, right?
Yeah.
So do they have the ability to mitigate the effects of climate change currently?
If mitigating the effects of climate change is
Do they
planting a
have the
tree,
mechanisms
I think
if
they
they are
do
poor?
have the mechanisms.
But
if
they are
it is
poor.
planting a tree, it does not need $1 billion to
Do they have the
particularly
ability
that.
to adopt to electric cars because of the poor roads that are existing there?
Okay, too. That is on the burden of government.
Do they?
Probably in that particular hand.
Okay,
And it
so
is government's
do we have
responsibility to do that. So
so
government
okay,
ought to.
Thank you. This theory exists in people. Do we have people in government?
Yes, we do.
So that means they'll also be taken up by this theory, right?
Well, the idea
So
that
there's no
government is most
oppression
probably
and
capitalistic
opposition
in
from
nature
government
does
because
not
they are
buy
people.
into that idea. I
Right?
think government treasures its economy more than
But
it
government
does
is
to
people,
the hope that it
and the
does to
theory is in
other.
people.
I still think people treasure their economic value over the hope of cool.
So the theory doesn't exist on your side.
I think the theory is not practical in that particular sense.
Is this a parallel debate?
Yes, please?
Is it a parallel debate?
No.
But you don't have engagement. I'll rest. Thank you.
Okay, that brings us to the close of the second segment. I kindly request that we be respectful of each other and very mindful during cross-examination. When you ask a question, give us time to listen to what the response of the question is. Let's have the second speaker from side affirmative advance the case for Gov Bench. Here. Okay, lovely. So let's have the second affirmative speaker to advance the case for Gov Bench. Here.
This House believes that the concept of degrowth is necessary to address environmental issues. My speech begins in 3, 2, 1. One of the first level of clarity you're most likely to get is that proposition is burdened to show why is it necessary in terms of economic climate, in terms of climate change, why it is necessary for us to be able to adapt to things like degrowth. But then secondly, this is a theory and not a policy. So side opposition does not have the obligation to ask us about the workability, right? But then secondly, a theory lives within amongst people. That is what people believe. That is what people are most likely to believe, right? What is necessary on side what is important is on why then in the first place individuals there is need for why it is important for individuals to be most likely to believe in this particular theory, right? But then firstly, on engagement, right? They tell us that it is important for developing countries to facilitate things like economic growth, right? We think that we think that economic growth looks like is what economic growth looks like on the other side of the house is that you being able to develop with a low startup capital, right? We think with a low startup capital, you give these particular individuals an incentive to invest in things that are less cost. That is to say excessive use of energy, but then secondly, things like carbon emitting products, right? We think that when you give the individuals that particular incentive, you're most likely to continue most likely to have economic growth, but then not the sustainable economic growth, right? But secondly, within the economic growth is most likely to be facilitated by things like the environment you're most likely to live in, right? When you live in an environment that is most like that has a bad environment, you're very less likely to have economic growth because that particular environment has already been degraded. You're very less likely to facilitate things like economic growth, right? But secondly, on the whole idea that economic growth is important, we think that economic growth is only important if at all it is most likely to like support the well-being of individuals, right? What then perpetuator economic growth looks like on that side of the house is that you already have the ability to sustain yourself. What then it looks like is you continuously wanting to excessively produce things, but that is problematic because you're most likely not to facilitate the well-being of individuals, just like how they're trying to support, because you create an environment that has bad air, that you say, you create an environment that is filled with things like carbon dioxide, that is very less likely to be able to like advantage those particular individuals, right? So we think economic growth that looks on the other side of the house does not facilitate a human well-being, but it's also situational. Secondly, on societal development, right? But secondly, on societal development, right? On the impact of degrowth, right? We think that degrowth does not limit the whole idea of development, right? We think that what degrowth does, it is most likely to create an incentive for individuals to invest in green technology, right? We think that this is then important because you create a sustainable development. But secondly, we think that states have a moral obligation to ensure sustainable development, right? What looks on the other side of the house is that you ensure development, but then that is not a sustainable development on the other side of the house, right? That is problematic because you're not most likely to facilitate human well-being because the environment is most likely to be bad, right? But then on extension, right, that is on the whole idea of resource consumption, right? We think what happens in perpetual economic growth is that we have businesses like fast fashion, right, that want to continuously maximize profits, right? There is a narrative that is most likely to exist for individuals. We think that this is problematic because you facilitate these particular individuals to excessively exploit these particular resources in society, right? We think that this is bad because you don't give these particular individuals an incentive to invest in green technology, right? What you do is that you make them think that what you need is profit maximization and not a good environment, right? We think that that is problematic because you're most likely to excessively use these particular resources that are most likely to you're most likely to excessively use these resources. Then secondly, in your process of production, you're most likely to produce things like carbon dioxide that are most likely to be problematic on this particular country because it is very less likely to achieve it. So the whole idea of things like environmental well-being, right? But then secondly, on status quo, right, they tell us that there is need for these particular individuals. The main way you're most likely to create change is that you make these particular individuals to invest in things like green technology. But understanding status quo, there is no incentive for these particular individuals to then invest in that green technology because you give them that particular idea that the main way you're most likely to maximize profits is when you're most likely to use things like carbon emitting products, right? But then on the other side of the house, you give those particular individuals an incentive that that investing in things like carbon emissive products is not the only way to sustain development, right? That is problematic on the other side of the house because one thing I keep on that is problem when you give them this particular idea because you're most likely to endanger the environment. That then does not achieve the principle of environmental protection and also things environmental accountability.
Okay, lovely. We thank the speaker for that speech. We welcome the third segment of cross-examination for this particular round. Here.
Okay, cool. I'll start the cross-examination from the top. Do you think increased population should be directly equivocal to increase in economic growth? Do you think there needs to be enough jobs for the people in society?
We think that the economic growth that looks on your side of the house is dangerous to this particular population because you create a bad environment for them. That means economic growth then loses its relevancy.
What if the economic growth was not dangerous to the environment? Would it be good?
You're most likely to be burdened to show us how then it is very likely to be burdened because you tell us in your characterization that it is characterized by things like emissive products of carbon.
A sort of other way, do you think that as a prerequisite to invest in a certain nation, and the ability to have to invest in green tech is incentive enough to use green tech?
because these particular individuals believe that economic growth is facilitated by things like low cost of
Okay,
production,
cool.
they're most likely
So
to
if
opt
it is
for carbon emitting
facilitated-
process of
if it is
production because they are
facilitated
cheaper, right? That incentive that you
by-
create by the incentive that you create by
Okay,
degrowth is you
thanks,
give these
I
particular
guess.
individuals an incentive to invest in green technology.
Okay, so what is the thing, or what is the judgment of telling people to invest in green tech and then limiting their market? Or what would that impact be if they cannot do what you want them to do?
That will be answered by.
Okay, cool. So another idea, if we are to prove to you that there are other alternatives of reducing the impacts, do you think we'd win the debate?
Your burden to show us what incentive to give individuals to invest in those alternatives.
Cool.
Those
So
alternatives.
if we could do that, do we win the debate?
If at all, you're most likely to do that.
Okay, two. Do you think it is economic growth or the impact of economic growth?
It is the impact of economic growth.
Okay, lovely. That brings us to the close of the third segment of cross-examination within this debate. We welcome the second speaker from side opposition to extend 30 seconds. Lovely.
I think I'll begin my speech right away. Now, Chair, side affirmative wants to make up look like today we are not caring about lives of individuals who are in certain places being affected by floods. What people who are being affected by floods need is not to stop them from doing their economic activities. They need resettlement camps. They need going in places where they can become resilient. The only way you can make them resilient is by strengthening their economic muscle and empowering them with money to do that. On degrowth side of the house is stopping a woman who depends on charcoal burning, who depends on like her whole economy is dependent on charcoal burning. What we do for her is not stopping charcoal burning. The only incentive there for her is telling her to cut a tree, do charcoal burning, and the only thing she can do is plant 5 more trees. The good thing with that is that firstly, the already affected harms or the burden that has with like climate change and the already existing harms on pollution are not taken by their side of the house. What we think that then happens on our side of the house is that when you plant trees, individuals in that kind of particular regard or the pollution that already exists is taken by already existing trees. But then secondly, it acts like an incentive for the charcoal woman because she thinks that when she plants more trees in the future, she will like get more and more trees to burn her charcoal. So her economic strain and like her economic muscle is strengthening in like the second span. But then secondly, the debate, the comparative of killing companies or maybe to stop pollution at an expense of to continue the economic qualities to opt for most likely green tech. I have the first reason why green tech is so good. Green tech is not good, not because companies are forced to do it as a burden law. Green tech is good because companies have the incentive. Companies have the money, companies have the economic muscle to do green tech. The good thing with that on our side of the house is that companies are able to activate green tech because companies in and of themselves want to operate in a system where climate change is like going to work. How that is necessarily going to work is that companies in and of themselves, when they have that kind of money, not because notice that the money or the green tech doesn't come from thin air. The green tech comes from things that are done by money. People that do green tech have the money. On their side of the house, we don't get why necessarily people would buy into their kind of idea. Secondly, that individuals compromise with their activities. On their first speech, they talk about how necessarily the economic burden that they paint in our side of the house is necessarily important. What we tell you is that the extent to which degrowth happens reaches a limit to where people depend on industries, right? The environmental pollution still exists, but people are, which is increasing. So when people are increasing, it gives us reason to want to put an economic infringe for people to become resilient, or even when climate change is like so bad, we need to become resilient. That then gives us enough reason to say that economics should be there for people to become resilient. But then secondly, what do we use that money for industry? We use that extract money from industries to mitigate the harms that come along with like climate change. But then again, on the other side of the house, we get things like societal backlash. We can have climate change solved, but still the economic system comes along. When people don't have money and resources, people got from companies, people focus essentially on like societal progress. So the money is for societal progress and for the society thrive in and of itself, right? So when that doesn't exist, it like acts on societal backlash. Why you should care about a problem with societal backlash is that the government in and of themselves have a burden to do with society. If society doesn't reach its economic interests and needs, we think that it is necessarily a problem on government. Then that is why we think that societal backlash is something we should care about in the debate. To the other side of the house, on extension, one, I think that in poor developing states, the problem that is pained in the cross-examination is that in poor development states, development is not done by people. Development is like done by foreign companies. We have a problem with that kind of specific idea. When development in poor states is like done on foreign countries, it is also dependent. We need these specific countries to depend on themselves. We need people in villages to strengthen their financial muscle. What then we do is that we give them a workspace where they can like achieve economic muscle, to say that when companies can most likely work and get like the kind of muscle, the way up then is that we think that companies in and of themselves to activate and work to get like the kind of money they get. We think that green tech is there to most likely mitigate the harms that come along with it. On upside of house, what we only get is lip service. You only send out a message to companies why it is necessarily bad to operate, to stop pollution, and that and only that. We don't get a mechanism on why stopping like companies to operate would work in our specific country, why that would stop the already existing harms of pollution, why that would necessarily work on our side of the house. The comparative then is that in capitalistic natures and companies, what is like necessarily good is most likely activate the economy, and things like resilience will be solved on our side of the house. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. We thank the speaker for that speech. We welcome the last segment of cross-examination for this particular round. Here.
So yeah, my time begins in 3, 2, 1. Chair, we don't want the debate to get off track. First question, is the debate about showing why economic growth is more important than protecting the environment, or is your burden showing that degrowth is not necessary to solve environmental problems?
Our burden is to show that degrowth is not solving the problem, as provided to when people are dying with floods. We don't stop operation of industries. What we do is that we give them
the motion is this house,
please.
The motion is this house believes that the concept of degrowth economics is necessary to address environmental issues. Is your burden to show that economic growth is more important, or to show that degrowth does not address environmental issues? Please respond.
Our burden is to show that degrowth does not get the two benefits: economic
I think, okay,
and express of climate.
Does the existence of a theory influence action?
The theory doesn't exist in like that kind of particular regard.
Okay.
The theory exists in people needs to work, and people need to buy in that kind of instance.
Please. When a theory about protecting the environment exists, is it then an incentive for people to take action?
When people are dying, what you need to give them again and again is money and replace them into
So distinguish between perpetual economic growth and economic growth. Give us a distinction.
We think people need economic growth at like particular...
Not perpetual economic growth, just like without the existence of deep growth, like necessarily fiat, right?
Perfect.
Very good. Is green technology important?
Green technology is so important.
So if I have a theory that I should maximize profits and not invest in good technology, how is it more likely for me to invest in good technology?
While I maximize profits, it is so good for me to remember that it is necessary to mitigate the harms that come along with it.
Do you have an obligation to sustain the existence of future generations?
Okay, that brings us to the last segment of cross-examination for this particular round, and we move on to the third speaker. Let's welcome the third speaker from side affirmative to extend the case and close it for government bench. Here.
Hi everyone. Hope you're all fine. I'll begin my speech very shortly. Ready, third speaker? Okay. I'll begin my speech. Now, only two things to clarify, panel. First thing they tell you that people need money when they are necessarily in these flooded areas. I don't see how necessarily buying into the idea of degrowth necessarily reduces the incentive for us to give them money, or the money existing in the first place. Which then show you that this is not just something to argue about. Clarity on the motion. This House believes that the concept of degrowth economics is necessary. What necessary means is that it has an advantage. Our side of the House is supposed to show you that with the existence of degrowth, we are in a better position to address societal issues. The side of the House is supposed to show you that with or without degrowth, we are still not able to solve the environmental issues. Two things we necessarily need to understand is that this debate is not about economic growth or proving on whether or not it exists or not. Things like that come in on jobs being created by investors and the impacts of social development are things that are flawed. What we need to necessarily conceptualize is on the necessity of degrowth in fighting in solving the environmental issues. Let me first engage. Talk about the idea that these particular individuals are what the people necessarily need. This particular individual doesn't necessarily need to stop the economic activities. But no, this is not a policy, this is a theory. We don't necessarily make these individuals stop the economic activities, but we make them reduce them. But also secondly, this perspective in the individuals that I have to profit maximize. That is why the woman will burn charcoal and he will not even get like 2K to buy a new tree to plant because she thinks that she's supposed to only care about her economic development. When I started the house, she will burn the charcoal, but the idea that the economic development is the only thing that is important will no longer be in her head, so she will be incentivized to use some of that money in things like necessarily buying a new tree to replant. What happens on that side of the house is that we have people reducing narratives like profit maximization. Second thing to talk about is that companies have money and they necessarily going to they're going to necessarily activate in green technology. But no, these companies have money. This necessarily brings about the incentive of profit maximization. When they necessarily care about profit maximization, they're less likely to engage into green technology. Why? They are more expensive. When you want to profit maximize, you're necessarily going to use cheap mechanisms like sources of energy, which are not necessarily renewable. In the end of it all, your idea of profit maximization wants you to use cheap sources of energy, and at the end of it all, you'll not be able to adopt. What outside of the house does on this particular matter is that we remove that concept of profit maximization because we make you believe that, my economic growth is not the only important thing, but other things that can also be important. So at the end of it all, we have individuals complying to the carbon taxes and the fines that are necessarily existing in society because they feel like they don't want profit maximize. Talk about the idea that these companies are rich. That is the very reason to why they don't buy into carbon taxes, because they have money to pay off the carbon taxes, but they don't have any incentive to make them shift because they want to necessarily profit maximize and they use cheap sources. Talk about the idea of population increasing, don't necessarily have to do away with the economy. But no, we're not doing away with the economy necessarily existing, we're necessarily reducing it to a sustainable state, i.e. the economy is able to sustain the individuals that are existing and the ones that are necessarily coming in. But what necessarily exists on the other side of the house is perpetual economic growth, i.e. they don't necessarily put into consideration things like economic growth, they just keep on cutting down trees. In outside of the house, you have industries existing that are enough to sustain the people, but people still want to establish more companies because they want to benefit themselves. They want to care about their economic growth in that particular matter. But on the side of the house, you have these individuals necessarily, but on the other side of the house, you have individuals necessarily not cutting down any more trees because they believe that, economic growth is already achieved at a step that is already sustainable to us. We don't necessarily need to keep on economically growing because of this particular concept. Secondly, talk about the idea is that is money necessarily useful? Money is something that is necessarily used for societal progress. But there's nowhere in this particular concept we tell you that money will stop existing. But also secondly, we tell you that the money in itself is inherently contingent to things like how you necessarily enjoy it. Even if you have a lot of money, but you're in drought and you cannot necessarily go out and swim on because there's no lake or anything like that, you necessarily most likely not enjoy that particular money, even if you have it in that particular matter. Talk about the idea of us stopping these companies from existing. But this is not a policy, this is a theory that runs in the minds of people, i.e. it runs in the owners of these particular companies and makes them to necessarily prioritize things that are more environmental friendly rather than necessarily making them stop. We're not necessarily making any policy, they should not lie to you. Talk about the idea of oppression from the government. Pano, the government is comprised of the people, this theory runs within the people, that means the government is supposed to be necessarily part of us because this theory is in the people themselves. What they necessarily bring to you is that even the government itself is necessarily going to prioritize funding things that are going to favor environmental issues. On that particular matter, we then see change. The main clash in this debate, is it necessary? We want to prove for you necessity. First thing on the environmental issues. Environmental issues include things like carbon emissions. is it necessary for us to have this particular concept in necessarily reducing the carbon emissions? One thing is that they remove the concept in people that we have to profit maximize. Profit maximization forces people to use cheap mechanisms of energy resuscitation. What that necessarily means is restricts them from renewable energy because they feel like it's so expensive and we want profit maximize, so we won't be developing economically. In the end of it all, the carbon emissions still increase, and the carbon and the policies that are existing don't get by. But also secondly, the nature of secondly on the idea of development. But not the growth that necessarily this particular debate is about the necessity, not development. But even if it's not a particular thing, we tell you that profit repatriation exists from these particular investors. In the end of it all, even the money you're getting from your particular country is taken away by the investors that are coming from particular other nations that are necessarily not giving you the incentive for that particular matter. Thank you.
Okay, that brings us to the close of the substantives from side affirmative within this debate. We welcome the third opposition speaker to extend the case for off bench. Yes? They had 1 minute left, right? Yeah. You have 1.5 minutes left. Okay, lovely. Let's welcome the third opposition speaker to close the debate so we can go and meet up with our dinner dates in Rahim's words. The people behind, kindly please maintain silence. If you cannot, feel free to walk for the dinner. Food is free.
I'll begin my speech now. So, panel, today's debate, as they paint it, is not necessarily about whether the concept exists. The theory exists. Today's debate is about whether it is relevant. Today's debate is about whether maybe policies that come out of this theory can work. If they cannot work, then it is not necessary. They need to prove to us that what comes out of the growth is relevant to environmental degradation. Okay, what do they run majorly? They run the concept that, you know what, people will most likely be incentivized to invest in green tech when they believe in the growth. But panel, when they agree to the fact that most countries don't have the financial muscle, just telling a person to invest in green tech does not make him do it. What makes him do it is the ability. That's why we bring the issue of the woman, right? When you tell him to cut a tree and plant two, you have given him the financial muscle to plant the two. Not only leaving her to survive, but also to plant the two. You know, they come and say the debate is not about development. But this theory challenges the idea that the human well-being cannot exist without continued economic development. So they need to come and tell us how, even with the growth, humans can continuously survive. They need to come and show us how humans survive in a concept of the growth. If humans cannot survive in your concept, then your concept challenging human existence then does not work in today's debate. But now look at the will versus capability. We think, for example, developed countries, they are more willing, or they have more majorly adopted green tech than poorly developed countries. Not because poorly developed countries do not want, but because they are not able to. But the other countries have got more incentive to buy into this idea than the others. And Pano, let's take an instance of landslides. When landslides occur in an area, you don't stop people from economic activities or tell them to reduce their economic activities. This is a condition where they need economic activities more than they have ever needed them before. But how our incentive works is that this financial muscle is reciprocated into environmental protection. But your idea of the house does not work. What they urge is life in a bad environment. We think life must exist whether the environment is good or bad. But our idea is that this life exists and this life breeds more life. In a sense, you use the environment and also protect it. Their idea, Pano, I think when you come to Aju, you need to listen to the other side. They need to understand that population is increasing, society needs are increasing. So when you argue for degrowth, you need to argue of how you cater for this. From our first speech, you told them how people are more, and you tell us how your resources becoming fewer supports that kind of economy. They do not. They just think that their idea of challenging the existence of people works anyways, and I think it does not work. Profit maximization, how does it fit into our context? From first speech, we tell you, for example, this woman with a tree wants to maximize profits, right? So she is more inclined to buy into a policy that tells her to keep cutting trees for as long as she plants more, rather than a policy that tells her to reduce the trees she's cutting. So if she's profit minded, she will buy into a policy that enables her to keep getting profits. But the idea that reduces her profits won't be bought into because she is profit minded, as they say. But let's look at their best case. Let's look at the best case that degrowth happens. Degrowth happening maybe as they wish. Degrowth will have a cap, right? Because degrowth cannot go on continuously because people will start dying and stuff like that. So when this cap happens, emission has necessarily not stopped, right? Emission is still there, and the emission that is existent has also not been stopped. But in our side of the house, it is very sustainable because production can increase as much as once, so long as environmental protection is ahead of it, right? So our idea of the house encourages sustainable protection of the environment with sustainable development of the people. The cap on our side of the house does not exist, but it exists on the growth, because the growth cannot continue inevitably, or it has to stop at some point in life, right? Pano, they come and say you need to take what you need and maybe leave the excess. But they are the same people who argue that in developing countries, that means people do not have the basic needs. They do not have what they need, right? So they do not have anything like an excess. You don't tell people who don't have any excess to stop and go to what they need. They are still struggling to get enough, right? They are still struggling to get what they need. So you don't tell them to stop or reduce what they need, right? Because they do not have enough in the first place. I think things like behavior and lifestyle cannot work on our side of the house. I don't think just because the growth happens, people reduce their lifestyle, because they need to survive anyways. Just because someone tells you, you know what, if you stopped using your car, you could do this. As long as you travel, you use the car, right? I don't think the growth works in today's debate anyways. Diabetes still on that point, right? If a person has diabetes, it is easier for him to buy into something that tells him to take as much sugar as he wants, for as long as that energy enables him maybe to work and buy insulin. It becomes easier for them. But when you tell him to take less food, it does not help him in any way. And nevertheless, even if you tell him to take less food, there is a cap to how much less food he can take. At the end of the day, he will reach a moment and he cannot reduce it anymore. But on our side of the house, no matter how much food he takes, as long as it gives him the energy to look for more insulin, it still works and is more sustainable to our side of the house. But their side of the house does not work because it has a cap, right? And the idea of green tech not working in areas where people do not have the money to afford it still works. Thank you very much. I beg to rest.
Okay, lovely. We thank the speaker for that speech, and that brings us to the close of the debate. You can cross over and greet each other, and after, go meet your dinner dates. All the best at the breaks.